Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Arca, titled Zen. But first, let's talk a little bit about abrasive sounds in music. Now this has been a conversation, well, ever since the beginning of recorded music, from the artists that are willing to push the boundaries of what is considered traditionally acceptable to the ears of the mainstream public. Now forget the explosive crunch of metal or the harsh mechanical sounds of industrial music or the raw edge of punk rock or the choppy sampling of early hip-hop. There were points in the past where the distorted guitars of early rock and roll or the experimentation of jazz was considered too much of a departure from mainstream listeners. The evolution of what is considered traditionally listenable, that's a growing one. And with every year, it seems to expand further and further, from the ruckus screams of black metal to the harsh blast of static that you get from a group like Clipping, to the experimental, explosive, crushing power of an act like Swans. Hell, there are bands in the power electronic genre that specifically focus on making the most explosive, abrasive, uncomfortable music possible for anyone to listen through. Guess I can kind of respect them from that, but Jesus. Now for me, abrasion for its own sake, it's got a place, but I also admit I tend to prefer music to have something of a melody, or at least enough texture to really justify the usage of that abrasion as a complete piece. Noise without cohesion just for its own sake is precisely that, it's noise. Now my challenge has always been finding the cohesion within the sound, or the melody, if it exists at all. Because, let's make this clear, this sort of abrasive noise and presence, that's not going away anytime soon. It's a trend, and it's likely one that's gonna stick around. Now this takes us to producer Arca, most well known outside of electronic music circles as working with Kanye West on Yeezus, and FKA Twigs on LP1. And going into his full-length debut Zen, I wasn't precisely sure what was coming. His early work was defined by pitch-shifted vocals, eerie synths, and moments that pushed the edges of what was conventionally considered listenable. In other words, I had a real challenge on my hands, at least I thought that. So with a certain amount of real trepidation, I managed to check out his debut album, Zen. What'd I find? Well, I definitely did not expect this. Now that seems to be a bit of a trend whenever I delve into experimental albums that I say that, because while this record is glitchy, abrasive, off-kilter in the extreme, it was done so in a way that I was not expecting, I can admit that. While some would consider Zen a noisy release, it's not so much noise as it is dissonant, filled with odd melodic progressions, tempo changes, and wild shifts that defy regular ideas of cohesion or groove. What this means is that while I do like Zen more than I expected, believe me, I'm surprised as hell this record managed to connect with me whatsoever. It's a weird as hell little album that is hard to recommend to anyone outside of the most dedicated experimental electronic music fans. In other words, this album isn't for anyone, but if you are interested, it is worth a listen. Now the first thing that I need to explain for this review to make any kind of sense is the musical concept of dissonance. Now as I described earlier, like how popular sensibilities have evolved in order to accept more abrasive sounds and textures in their music, so have we grown to accept more off-kilter and dissonant chord structures beyond the major fourth and major fifth. Because like it or not, there's a place for dissonance in mainstream music, creating tension before the release of a conventional chord or melody. Well, Arca Zen seems designed to push that dissonant tension to the absolute limit, with all sorts of melodic progressions that might initially set you on edge until he breaks it with a more conventional minor or major chord, if he breaks it at all. To make matters even worse, he shifts the melodic tempo wildly against the beat within the song to make what might seem like accessible progressions on chords make them even harder to take in, especially when placed in contrast with the beats, which are normally one of the few stabilizing influences in any of these songs. And upon the first few listens, it's very tempting just to see this album as a sloppy, atonal mess, especially considering how many traditionally classical instruments that Arca uses, from string sections to flutes to harps, to emphasize that discordance. Instruments this elegant and proper sounding should not sound this off-kilter and twisted, especially when paired with harmonic synths that are so shrill and cutting. And paired with tunings and synth choices that almost seem purposefully off-key, it's the sort of composition that could easily be dismissed as incompetent rather than any sort of transcendent or let alone good. Yet for me, okay, he falls somewhere in between. I'm not going to deny that it gets pretty exasperating when Arca puts together a pretty damn great melodic groove I did like, or progression, then chooses to put it against sounds that only seem to divert from any sort of momentum that this album could have built. Where Object's Flatland was all meticulously constructed with willfully, slightly askew rhythms to emphasize the imperfections in modern machines, each piece interlocking together, Arca's Zen internal connections are much more scattershot that when they appear at all. In fact, this record might serve as a very solid counterpoint to that other experimental electronic record. One's all rhythm and groove, the other shining brightest with interweaving melodies that either flutter or spasm from their respective instruments. And let me stress this, there are great melodic moments on this album with phenomenal texture in the production that I really did like. I love the mournful harpsichord pianos on Held Apart that recalled a lot of Aphex Twin, the tentative skittering on Sad Bitch that becomes gloriously decadent in its upper range across the back half of the track, the shimmering off-kilter cadence on Sisters that just really wowed me, the looming sense of unease on Family Violence thanks to the strings, the sudden tempo drop on Lonely Thug that makes the track even more haunting, the gorgeous strings balanced against the pitch-shifted voice on Wound, and the cascading strums on Promise that sounded really great against the bass rumble at the same pace with this explosive blast of static coming in just at the right time. I really dug it. But for me, there are three things holding back Arca's Zen from being anything sort of special, at least for me. Now, the first is in some of the production. For the most part, it's absolutely gorgeous, but you can tell in the mix that balance that some of the strings, they feel a little bit hollow, not letting the sound fully swell across. And while the reverb does add some necessary depth to this album, it did feel a little bit overused at points. Now, the second is a matter of some of the beats. For as intricate and as detailed as the melodies are, it's a little startling that the same attention wasn't given to any of the very sparse beats on this album. When they're here at all, they're very leaden and blocky, rarely bringing to the same level of finesse or detail or even texture that the melody lines have. And this ties probably to my biggest issue with this album as a whole. There are many moments where the album gets in its own way when it comes to a really solid groove or some sort of climax, or at least giving these melodies more of a steady backbone off which they can ricochet. Now, there are some exceptions to this. The great groove at the end of the title track that I like, Thievery, the closest thing to a conventional song this album has, with choppy vocal samples and echoing melody, the sudden stops and starts with a gunshot-like snap that triggers the escalating piano melody on the back half, or the borderline industrial song Bullet Chained that sounds like a rolling spool of chains glancing off pipes against the most frantic beat, yet that breaks off into this great explosively heavy synth riff. I dug the hell out of it. Now, these songs show just how much promise Arca has with fusing melodic experimentation with textured beats, and yet for every one of these tracks, we get some sort of propulsive momentum. We get two other songs that feel a little bit too languid and don't do enough to really earn their atmosphere, like the reverb swallowed up Slit Through, the meandering organ heavy and really kind of glitchy song Fish, or the shrill and warped song Tongue that barely evolves beyond the heavy scratching and a bass melody that just can't bother to rise to the surface. So you know what? In the end, Zen by Arca reminds me a bit of Aphex Twin's album Drux from 2001, flipped in reverse with more of a focus on pushing melodic boundaries over drill-like beats, most of which is tempered through classical interludes. But if anything, Zen is an even weirder album, a shorter, messier blend of a dozen musical ideas that are frequently fascinating and really quite beautiful, with melodic progressions unlike most that you will hear this year, but at the same time, it lacks cohesion and a lot of momentum, and many of the dissonant progressions really lack a real true payoff, at least for me. And yet, even saying that to myself, these are pretty minor complaints, and with every listen, I find more to really like with this release, so I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation. And while I definitely cannot promise this album will be for anyone, the off-kilter melodies and tempo changes will make this a very difficult listen for a lot of mainstream listeners, in fact, a lot of electronic music listeners. But you know what? I'd argue this works. So go on, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. What do you guys think of the dissonant sounds on this album? It kind of eventually clicked for me in picking out some progressions, but it took a while. What about for you? If there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.